this is to Mrs. Thatcher and to our guest of honour. In a minute, I'm going to introduce Charles properly, and in the meantime, I'd like the brilliant director of the CPS, Tim Knox, to say something about how brilliant the CPS is.
Thank you, Maurice. These are very exciting times indeed to be the director of London's leading independent think tank. Thank you. Talking to many of the senior special advisors and ministers throughout Whitehall, it's quite striking how sharp the appetite is for the work that we are doing. From our work in encouraging enterprise, to less regulation, to simplifying taxes, to reducing the size of the welfare state, we are now being invited into the corridors of power in such a way as been really quite rare until just a few months ago. Now, there may be some cynics here who might be just thinking that, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But you don't have to take my word. This quote from a leading financial journal says quite a lot. Either the Centre for Policy Studies has developed serious powers of clairvoyancy, or they've got the ear of our Chancellor. Either way, the spoilers ahead of the autumn statement later this year, you could do worse than look at anything coming out from the Centre for Policy Studies. So those of you who are here this evening who already support our work, many, many thanks, and be certain that we will continue to campaign on our founding principles of freedom within the rule of law, a small state, and a strong nation. For those of you who are not yet members, then the excellent news is that when you buy a copy of Charles's fantastic book, which I'm sure you will all do, there will be membership forms so that you can continue to see whether our clairvoyancy skills are all they are cracked up to be. Thank you very much.
Can I say a word about our guest of honour? It strikes me, and I'm sure you all agree, that Charles has always been known as one of our great writers. I would say that with this amazing trilogy, Charles has risen into the pantheon of Britain's greatest historians and biographers, and I hope you agree. Charles describes in his books and in his words, and I think he's going to say a word about that in a minute, where he's agreed to speak to us and also to answer some of our questions. He describes a particularly important moment in the relationship between Mrs. Thatcher and the think tank she founded, which was that he describes a day in which she was sitting on the floor of the original office of the Centre for Policy Studies, and she was putting the plug on a kettle. However, Charles points out that she wasn't putting a plug on the kettle at all. What she was doing was rewiring conservatism. And what Mrs. Thatcher has done in creating the CPS and in sending us forward to this day tonight is that she gave us a very clear philosophy. Her wiring diagram had a very clear sense of direction and a very clear destination. Some people say that those are rather un-Tory qualities, but nevertheless, they are our qualities. There is an alternative view of conservatism from hers. It was put to a press officer in the Conservative Central Office at a recent general election. The question was put, what does your party actually stand for? To which the answer that was given was, if you want philosophy, read Descartes. So, around the CPS we don't read Descartes, we read Mrs. Thatcher. She gave us a very clear philosophy, which we try to put into place. You'll know it all. If you want a bigger slice of cake, the best thing to do is bake a bigger cake. Here. Caring that works costs cash. The story of the Good Samaritan shows that first, which she loved, shows that first you need the money in order to do the good works. That lower tax is good for moral reasons, because it means more freedom and choice for individuals, and ironically, for economic reasons, because lower tax rates mean higher tax revenue in the long run. So, as she put it, a small state, low tax, independence, individuality, self-determination. And as her heirs and successors, the illustrious board of the CPS, all of whom are here tonight, take it as our job, and in fact as our duty, to take her values and her philosophy forward and convince, as Tim Knox is saying, convince anyone who will listen that these are the values and this is the philosophy that should be the basis of policy making. To that end, as many of you know because you were there, when Mrs. Thatcher first became ill, we inaugurated the Thatcher Cps Lecture. It was, the first lecturer was Rupert Murdoch, followed by Boris Johnson, followed by Charles Moore himself, and this year the next lecturer of the Thatcher Lecture will be the Chancellor, George Osborne. Many of you were at the CPS Thatcher conference at the Guildhall, to which 1,000 people came, the great Prime Ministers, statesmen, Chancellors, Ambassadors, Generals. It was a remarkable gathering, at which we launched CapX, which we described as the world's first global electronic think tank. And I'm very pleased to announce tonight that last month for CapX was its biggest month, a record, 367,000 page views in the last month for CapX. So, thank you very much. This is all well and good, but I would like to, if I may, just end with this. All that the CPS does is marvellous, and the CPS is amazing, is an amazing place. But if I could give you a version, putting all that to one side, of why Mrs. Thatcher deserves to have such a brilliant biographer, and is herself now a true icon, it would be this, with permission from Sandra Howard and Michael Howard. Their son took his goddaughter, aged 12, some time ago, to go and see the Thatcher film, The Iron Lady. When their son came out, he said to her, aged 12, "Well, what did you think?" And his goddaughter replied, looking up at him, "I know what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be a Conservative Member of Parliament."
Yeah.
Now beat that for a legacy. And here's the author.
Well, thank you very much, Maurice, and ladies and gentlemen. And the first thing I must do, of course, is thank the Centre for Policy Studies for giving this amazing occasion. Many of us are deeply grateful to think tanks, but we don't associate them with sort of luxury, elegance, and plenty of room. And it's absolutely marvellous to be here, thanks to Maurice, in Saatchi's, rather than cramped and crushed into those tiny rooms that we've all had to survive in all the various think tanks over the years. And I particularly like to thank Tim, who spoke to you earlier, and dear Jenny Nicholson, who has done so much to put it together. And there are so many different things, of course, aspects that I can talk about all too readily about Margaret Thatcher. And when people ask me questions, you might be surprised to know that when I give talks, they almost never ask about her and politics. Even though she was quite interested in the subject of politics. They tend to be about things like her as a woman, her struggles, her relationship with the Queen, her relationship with her son, her belief in God, and so on. It's quite remarkable how rarely they ask me about politics. I think the thing to talk about tonight is not exactly politics, but is to do with ideas, because this is her special contribution and the CPS's special contribution. And I want to thank you, Maurice, not only for this wonderful occasion tonight, but because it takes one back through, between you and the CPS, one way or another, it takes one back through the course of what happened. And Maurice mentioned at the beginning how it all really did begin with the generation of ideas, which was with the Centre for Policy Studies. It's not really an exaggeration to say that, because after the defeat of February 1974, everything was a mess. And the only important politicians who were rethinking were Keith Joseph, the founder of this, and Margaret Thatcher, I think she was the vice chairman, wasn't she, or words to that effect. And it's very characteristic of her that she was actually sitting, there were no wires, and in those days, through the sort of union rule that she abolished, you couldn't buy a plug with a kettle. You had to buy the kettle, and then the plug, and then you had to get it wired up for some amazing piece of closed shoppery or a demarcation or something. And so she actually was fiddling around with the wires to make it work. And it is, as Maurice said, a brilliant metaphor for what she was trying to do. And then if we move on a little bit, you remember that, and now we're talking about the Saatchis, not about the CPS, that this great slogan, "Labour isn't working," which is terribly famous. And I wonder if any of you here who do not work for Saatchis can tell me when that poster was produced.
78.
Quite right. No, quite right. 78. This is the thing. Everybody thinks that it won the 1979 election, and it certainly had played a part in that. But what it really did was prevent Jim Callaghan from calling the October 78 election. And if he had, he very likely would have won it. But he was spooked by... I'm not sure the poster ever went up in more than about 5 sites, but what he did do was they showed it to the Daily Mail. And the Daily Mail made a great deal of it. Everyone got very excited, and poor Jim Callaghan, sitting in his farm in Sussex, wondering whether to call an election, decided not to. And the rest is history, I'm afraid inordinately long history in this case. And so Saatchi's played this key role, and they continue to generate talent and people relating to what Mrs. Thatcher was trying to do. And one of the things I describe in this book is the less happy time when some of them are disagreeing with others, and Mrs. Thatcher was trying to work out whom to support, and it's marvellously complicated. Page 703 particularly juicy. And this famous thing called Wobbly Thursday in the 87 election, where Mrs. Thatcher had a terrible tooth abscess and thought she was going to lose the election because one opinion poll had her lead over Labour of only 4%. Well, imagine that nowadays, that you'd be worried about that. Morris was smuggled into number 10 with his lot, and then another lot was smuggled into number 10, another lot of what was called the War of the Agencies. And they had a great argument, and I just want to find you, because it is funny how these things seem important at the time and clearly of no importance whatever in the great scheme of things. What should the slogan be? Because David Young decided, I think psychologically rightly, that Mrs. Thatcher would absolutely have a nervous breakdown if she couldn't agree a slogan, even though it was who cared really. And finally, Tim Bell, who was at odds with Saatchi's at this point, said, "It should be Britain's a success again, don't let Labour ruin it." There was a massive row, and famously David Young shook first Norman Tebbit and then Morris by the lapels, and it was agreed, however, only slightly modified by the skills of Saatchi's, to "Britain is great again, don't let Labour wreck it." And on that, with that wonderful slogan, swept the country with a majority of 100. This second volume is about Mrs. Thatcher's zenith. The first was about her rise, and this is about her zenith. And so that means from victory in the Falklands until victory in the 1987 election. So a period of what looks in retrospect, a period of tremendous dominance. Actually, as I think I show, it didn't feel like that at the time, and it certainly didn't feel like that to her. She was extremely nervous all the time. She felt very, very vulnerable, and indeed she was, as the Western crisis proved. But I think the theme we need to think about briefly tonight, and then I'll answer questions on anything, is the power of ideas in what happened in this period. If you think of the triumphs of this period, and you think of the disasters, you can start to sort of weigh all this in the balance. The most obvious triumphs are victory in the miners' strike, the advancement of privatization, and the world scene, and particularly her enormously growing importance on the world scene, and her relationship with Gorbachev and of course with Reagan, and the way that she used the relationship with Reagan to build up the relationship with Gorbachev and move on towards the end of the Cold War. And the obviously less happy things were Westland, which was clearly very unhappy at the time, and the poll tax, which in the period covered seemed really pretty happy, but wasn't so happy a bit later on. That's volume 3. And also, I think, relations with colleagues. Now, if you think of these issues, I'll leave aside relations with colleagues, and I think Westland for this purpose, because this is not really about ideas, this is about another factor about Mrs. Thatcher, which is how did she deal with people? Very important aspect of her, but not relevant to the main thing we're talking about tonight. But I think those things, poll tax, miners, privatization, and Gorbachev, what you see in all of those things, for better and for worse, but actually mainly for better, is the outworking in practical policy of ideas and beliefs that she had and which she developed with the help of many people here tonight. And this is very, very significant because politicians tend to want to say how pragmatic they are and how stupid intellectuals are, or not stupid, but how pointless intellectuals are. But actually what you need to do is a sort of combination between the two, because of course intellectuals are not normally practical people and they do have idiotic ideas in certain respects, but their ideas can push forward thoughts that other people wouldn't have, and then they can turn into something which is actually done. And Mrs. Thatcher was, I think, not an intellectual, but was a genius at seeing that, because she could weaponize ideas. She was fascinated by ideas, and then she could, to use the phrase that I think Ed Miliband is supposed to have used in another context, weaponize them. And that's the thing, and that's what happened. So the miners' strike we don't think of it in terms of ideas, but actually, think what happened 10 years earlier with the defeat of Ted Heath's government with the miners. This was because of a different idea about how you organize industrial relations and how you try to run the salaries of nationalized industries and how you try to relate one to the other and all of those things, and what sort of industrial relations laws you have. Mrs. Thatcher rethought all that, and therefore she wasn't ready in 1981 when she had to give in to the miners, but she was ready by 1984 because she had actually thought it through, and she'd done the mental preparation and then she'd done the physical preparation, which was the piling up of the stocks. So you can see a sort of practical thing and the beliefs working together. And I think the same is true with everything about Gorbachev and the Cold War, because she and Reagan, she's called the Iron Lady, of course, because that's what the Red Star, Red Army newspaper called her as an insult in 1976. She immediately grabbed that title because she could see how powerful it was. And what she and Reagan were saying at that time was completely out of the orthodoxy of the period in Western governments. They were saying détente is dangerous because we are way behind the Soviet Union, who are still advancing. And when they had advanced, when they had installed cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe, they then thought everything can change. And she was actually, I think, quicker than Reagan in that respect to see that from that position of strength, you need to look for the interlocutor in the communist world. And she found it in December 1984 in Gorbachev. And from that moment, which is described in great detail because I found what they all actually said to one another, you can see, and at that, from that moment, the move towards the end of the Cold War began, and you can see them, and again, it's ideas, because what they have in this 6 hours is conversation. It's just arguing the whole time, like clever students, about communism's bad, freedom's better, he says capitalism's dreadful, and so on and so on. And actually, on the basis of that argument, they start to create an interesting relationship. So again, the idea works through into the practice and into the policy with happy results. And finally, in this category, privatization, which was a sort of belief, an intellectual belief that a lot of free market people had. But the thing was, could you do it? That was what it kept falling down on in the 70s. Could you do, who wants to buy these wretched industries apart from anything else when they're so badly run and so unionized and so subsidized? And so what you had to do was have the thought, and then you had to develop the ways and the means. And she did that very successfully with her policy unit, for example. And so suddenly something which was really dismissed, not as bad exactly in the 70s, but as impossible, became visibly possible. And once it became possible, it became popular, and once it had worked its way through, it became global. And one of the extraordinary things about privatization is it is the biggest policy export in British history. It could be the British policy export in the history of any country. I talked to Oliver Letwin about this because he went and did a lot of it. He and John Redwood did so much for it in when they were in Number 10, and then later Rothschilds. And I just asked Oliver, where did you try to, he told me he was always running, I remember him always running around the world trying to do privatization. And he told me where he did privatization. And it just reminds you of how it did work as an export business. He advised Canada, the United States, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Honduras, Kenya, Tanzania, Congo, Brazzaville, Morocco, South Africa, Ivory Coast, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, Italy, France, Ireland, Portugal, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Ireland, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Russia, and even Cuba. And that is what happens when you have the idea, and then you make it work, and then people can recognize that fact, and on that basis, a huge amount can be done in the practical world. The CPS had a massive amount to do with all of that, but I think it does come back to the subject of my book herself, because of her. We all know, because she was always saying that she was a conviction politician. But any old fool can be a conviction politician. They can all say what they believe. The question is, what is the relationship between what they believe and what they do, and their capacity to implement on the basis of what they believe, what is worth doing. And it's that combination which is virtually unique, and which I think we're celebrating tonight. So thank you.
Charles has said that he's happy to take a few questions. Who would like to? Yes.
During the mid-1980s coincided with sanctions controversy about South Africa. Thatcher council was beaten on Hong totally decided the rest of the Commonwealth. Would you care to say something about this?
I'd be very grateful. Would we all please listen to our guest a moment?
Sorry, do leave when you had. The question was about South African sanctions.
And the Commonwealth.
And the Commonwealth. This is a very interesting piece of Mrs. Thatcher's character in this book, because she believed that sanctions against South Africa were a bad idea, partly because they would damage British exports, British industry, and partly because they would produce revolution, she thought, in South Africa, and partly because she thought they would hit the wrong people in South Africa, they would hit the black workers. The Commonwealth thought otherwise, and she was completely isolated. And this is a very interesting example of her, because almost every other political leader, I think, would have said, well, it doesn't really matter all that much, so let's agree with the Commonwealth. And they would have gone through a whole lot of motions about this. And indeed, Mrs. Thatcher was forced to concede some things. But she did, in fact, maintain the position, because what I think she was really looking for, and it was very tough for her in 1986, and there was the great embarrassment of it became clear that the Queen was unhappy about the position because of Commonwealth unity. What Mrs. Thatcher was really looking for was an interlocutor in the South African government in order to bring about change, which she couldn't get out of President Botha. And she found that interlocutor, not in the period covered in this volume, but in the next, with F.W. de Klerk. And so actually, the policy looked really unsuccessful at this time and became successful later. And by the way, I discovered, 'cause it's quite funny, it was all said, particularly when she died, that she wanted to hang Nelson Mandela and all this sort of thing. I actually discovered she's the first British Prime Minister to demand the release of Nelson Mandela. And this was one of her demands made with her one meeting with President Botha. It was on the schedule of her demands. So it was in a way, it was quite like the Gorbachev process.
Yes,
do you think it's possible for a Margaret Thatcher to rise in today's political environment?
Is it possible for a Margaret Thatcher to rise in today's political environment? Well, you can't imagine a similar style, can you? I mean, it wouldn't be like that. And you can't imagine the handbag as the orb and sceptre of rule. Actually, I'm slightly surprised it hasn't arisen recently, because Margaret Thatcher is a great politician for bad times and a less great one for good times. Because she's a sort of transformative one and a rescuer and a changer rather than a consolidator and I'd have thought that since the credit crunch, well, in fact, I think it's clear that since the credit crunch, the Western world has lacked people, leaders, who can sort of say, right, what is this really about? Why has it got to change? Some people thought this would come with President Obama, but I don't think it did. And similarly, quite a lot of other leaders, you get little bursts, like the parable of the sower, of the sort of seed shooting up briefly, and then, Hollande, of all people, for about 6 weeks when people said he was the solution. So, I'm actually I think there's a gap in the market, in fact, for this, in this time when there's a crisis of capitalism and of everything, really.
Where else can I see a hand? Over here.
Could I ask thank you. Could I ask a question about Thatcherism? You talked a lot about the ideas of Thatcher, but some historians say there's quite a disconnect between the first term and the second term. The first term dominated by monetarism, the second term more about privatization, which emerged at the FI. To what extent did you see a kind of development of ideas and also a consistency in her thinking?
Well, first of all, there is I think there is some consistency, and there is obviously also a development, which you'd expect, because first of all, you had to sort of put your holes in the dike, fingers in the dike, in the holes in the dike. So first of all, everything to do with money and spending, and then when you've done that, it's a stronger position to reform labour law, start to sell off industries. I mean, you have to establish confidence. Everything to do with money, you have to establish confidence. And that's a key point about privatisation, isn't it? Only with the confidence could you start selling this stuff. So I think that is consistent. I mean, I think she would have said that she essentially, it took her till 1986. Bernard Ingham said to me that one moment they were sitting in number 10, you know, she's always usually moaning about things. And then she suddenly had a sort of moment of joy when she said, I think the country really is changing. Our economic policies really are affecting the way people actually behave. So they now believe they can do things that they didn't used to think they could. And I think there was a lot of truth in that. And then it may be, though I haven't got there yet, that some of this went a bit awry in the last term, when perhaps it was less clear what the direction had to be, or less possible to achieve that direction.
Who would like to ask the penultimate question? Or I exercise the prerogative to ask the last one. Over here.
Charles, if she'd been Prime Minister today, do you think she would have embraced the digital age or been scared of it?
Would she have embraced the digital age? Well, I'm afraid I always refuse to answer the hypothetical, because all I know is what she did do, of which there's more than enough. But she was, of course, if you said, what's it feel like to be the first woman Prime Minister, she'd say, oh, I'm much prouder of being the first science Prime Minister with a science degree. Actually, not really quite true, because she was very proud of being the first woman and thought about it a lot. But she tactically thought it was a bad thing to say. But she was the first British Prime Minister with a science degree. And so she was very interested in all technological and scientific change. There is one funny thing, though, sorry, this is not about the digital age, but when she'd just come into number 10, her chief scientific advisor came to see her, and she said, I'm a scientist, why do I need a chief scientific advisor? And he gave 1 or 2 points. And she said, well, what are you working on? And he said, well, there's this thing, we think that there's climate change. And she said, are you telling me that the government has to be concerned about the weather? But you see, curiously, because of her scientific interest, she was, in fact, the first Prime Minister to give a great in-depth speech about climate change, which is not in this volume because it's 1988.
I'm going to exercise my prerogative to ask Charles the final question. I'm going to ask him if he will share with the gathering what he told me about one of the most controversial aspects of Mrs. Thatcher's premiership, which was her anxiety about Germany and her concern that German reunification would lead to a German domination of Europe, and particularly about the conversation you described to me between Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister and Chancellor Kohl as Chancellor of Germany at that time. Could you tell us?
Well, thank you, Maurice. Many people think, and there's a lot of reason for thinking this, that Margaret Thatcher's not finest hour was the reunification of Germany, because she had wished it in the sense that, of course, she wanted had worked very hard for the Berlin Wall to fall, and then when it started to happen, she was not, of course, in favour of the wall coming down, but she was not in favour of German reunification, and she seemed to resist the logic of the situation. And there's no doubt, it must be said, that she was viscerally anti-German, in a way that some people of that generation were. And so the prospect of German, she took me aside once and she said, in a corner in a room, and she said, you know what the trouble with Helmut Kohl is, as if this was a secret. You know what the trouble with Helmut Kohl is? And I said, no, what is it? She said, he's a German. Which rather showed what, he rather epitomized Germany in the thing she didn't like about Germany, particularly he ate pig's trotters and things like that, and made her eat it, but she didn't. And he hated mint sauce. He used to send her lots of messages before going to Chequers about how please could he not have mint sauce. So there was a big culinary. Sorry, I'm diverting, but what she thought was the German reunification, where she had a point, 2 points actually. One was that it could destabilize the Soviet Union. She was worried that the hardliners would try to prevent it and would overthrow Gorbachev, which did in fact nearly happen in 1991. And secondly, she thought that German dominance of Europe was dangerous. Mitterrand came to her and he said, the price for German reunification that we must exact is the single currency, because that will bind Germany in. And she said, no, you got it exactly the wrong way around. If you have the single currency, it will create a German Europe, because Germany is dominant financially. And that, in that respect at least, she must be considered to be 100% right.
What a wonderful thing it is. Charles described the almost impossible combination of an intellectual who also knows how to make things happen. That's what Charles Moore is. Should we congratulate him on this?